Hi, my name is Amanda Wilbur, and this is my presentation on environmental and cultural factors that affect intellectual disabilities. I chose this population because I worked with people with disabilities before nursing school for close to 10 years, and I find that advocating for them and bringing awareness is incredibly important. A little background on health disparities that affect this population is lack of education, decreased income, and decreased access to health services. Those with intellectual disabilities as a group experience more chronic diseases, which makes this group critically important in the pursuit of health promotion. The media. The media is an interesting topic for this vulnerable population, and it plays a powerful role in the stigmas that surround them. Those with disabilities are often portrayed as having a disability, while non-disabled individuals are seen in the media without having their ability or lack thereof be presented. Um, this creates, so often we see them as objects of charity, and they find happiness by overcoming their own diversity, which, that's a barrier. I believe that if they have to overcome their own diversity and who they are to find happiness, that just continues with the stigma and the stereotypes. So due to this, inaccurate portrayal results, which puts this vulnerable population at increased risk for being misunderstood and for the stigma surrounding this population to continue. The importance of family support and role of peers. Those with intellectual disabilities can struggle to meet the basic needs in their lives and often rely on family and/or peers. The lack of support can be damaging and can negatively impact their quality of life. So it is important to advocate for this population to ensure they have the opportunity to obtain relationships with peers, especially if family is not present. In my personal experience, more times than not, I observe this population either having a dysfunctional family unit or none at all. Of course, this isn't always the case, but in my experience, this is what I saw. Some have great families that are there that support them, um, but others do not. They have families that they don't even see, or they have families that they see seldom, or that just don't support them in helping them with their physiological, their safety, feeling loved and belonged, and their self esteem. That can be a barrier for a lot of these individuals. The cultural environment. So, the cause of vulnerability that allows intellectual disabilities to pass from generation to generation can be either genetic and or environmental. So, some non-genetic reasons for intellectual disability could be asphyxiation during birth, infection, or accidents that occur after birth. Um, if genetics is the cause, then this can pass through generations. If genetics is not the cause, the abuse, rejection, and social exclusion that an individual may experience through their life because of their intellectual disability can be passed down through to other generations. So maybe they don't have an intellectual disability that's genetic, but the emotional component can continue. So, genetic or not, characteristics of either can be passed down. The legal and political system, I chose to the barriers of this because there are barriers. One of those political barriers that hinders this population within the state of Utah is funding availability through the Division of Services with Disabilities, also known as DSPD. So, one example of how the political system plays a role with this vulnerable population is through the use of funding. For an individual who does not have financial means to support oneself, they are able to obtain funding, which can be used for employment, housing, and ADL services. The barrier to this is the long wait times, which in the state of Utah can exceed 10 plus years. This does vary from state to state and is not the case everywhere. States like Wyoming do not have a wait list at all. The way that this works is an individual with disabilities, they have to go through an application process, and that in itself, they need support if they're unable to find and obtain those services. So then each year, through the legislative process, fundings are given to DSPD that can be distributed to this vulnerable population. Now, depending on how many people are getting the funding needs, that hinders how many new people can begin services every year. I have seen that, I've worked with people that maybe one person with disabilities has so much funding that they would never use all that money, an entire year, while another individual that critically needs the funding can't even get off the wait list. It's it's not completely broken, but there's a lot of barriers to this system, and I would love for that to be changed so that everybody that needs services would be able to get them. Potential barriers in our cultural environment. So, a few stigmas that surrounds population is that they are lazy, they're careless, and they're unintelligent. Due to these stigmas, barriers from that include social avoidance, stereotyping, discrimination, and hate crimes and violence. I found this campaign. It's called Let's Think Again. It was started in Pennsylvania in 2016, and I think it's great. It's their goal is or was, I'm not sure if it's a continued campaign, but was to stop stigma surrounding disabilities. To do so, they created these provocative signs that were posted throughout their communities. And these signs were in hope to bring awareness so somebody could read back. Maybe these are things that they say out loud, but they don't know how it's perceived on the other end. So reading that back brings awareness to how our words are portrayed. Cultural environment. I chose, with my research, I found that India is a country that has questionable decision making in regards to women with intellectual disabilities. So, this country has brought up questions of human rights issues and their treatment of women who have an intellectual disability. So, typically, at any age in India, if you are a woman and found to have an intellectual disability, your family and/or the government can consent for you to be placed in an institution. The conditions are often unsanitary, and both physical and sexual abuse is common. Not all individuals are institutionalized, though. If they are not, then they face similar barriers outside of the institutions, which includes denial of access to reproductive health services. They are likely to be ridiculed and feared by their communities. Another interesting tidbit is that electroshock therapy is still used in India. It was used here in the United States for a long time, and it was thought to help cure people with disabilities, but we quite a while ago got rid of that therapy, but in India it is still a common practice. Health disparities with socioeconomic status. People with intellectual disabilities face a barrier of unemployment, which puts them at one of the highest populations in terms of poverty. Ability, stigma, and access to resources all play a role in this issue. According to the UN, 50 to 70% are unemployed, which is consistent globally. Poverty in this population leads to a decline in health and overall lack of quality in all aspects of life. I did find some numbers that were higher than 50 to 70%, but this was the lowest that I found, so I decided to go with this. This is a barrier to their life and their lifestyle and their access to healthcare. Prevalence of disability among different ethnicities. Health disparities with both intellectual disabilities and race are a compound issue. This is meaning racism among a discriminated group, whether that's Hispanic, Asian, African American, Caucasian, whichever race it may be, that discrimination and racism will still continue, but there will be a compound effect by having the additional stigma that comes along with the disability. This creates even more diversity, discrimination, biasm than if they were just one or the other. It's a barrier, and it's something that I think is important to talk about. Benefits of religion. So, according to a study that was done in 2019, although research on religion effects on this vulnerable population are very limited, religion and spirituality have been found to have a positive effect on health outcomes. Some of these include improved self-esteem, increased motivation in daily activities and life, and a sense of purpose. Those that seek religion also gain community and support. Health disparities. I chose to focus on the female gender. So, a research study was completed in Utah and found that women face greater health disparities related to disability at a ratio of 3 to 1 compared to that of men. Women with disabilities have the same risk rate of pregnancy, but they often have less access to prenatal and overall health or women's health resources. They also have a decreased spiritual wellness and are more likely to live in poverty compared to men with intellectual disabilities. I think that's really interesting, especially in the state of Utah. I would have thought it would have been equal, but it was really interesting to find out that women have greater health disparities. Health disparities. I chose rural communities. Intellectual disability is higher in rural communities. According to the CDC, the statistics are 1/3 of adults in these communities have a disability, which is significantly higher than those that live in urban communities. It is also found that children and younger adults are much less likely to receive special education and early intervention. It is also found that there is a smaller occurrence that seek mental and physical health checkups. Some resources that could help this issue is telehealth and mobile health clinics, which are two options that improve health outcomes in rural communities. Biasm. Findings suggest that biasm towards intellectual disabilities increases over time, despite the minimal amount of people who actually acknowledge the bias exists. And the interesting thing about implicit versus explicit is that implicit bias becomes worse with time, meaning someone continues to build upon their bias, typically unknowingly. At the same time, though, explicit bias decreases, which means a person's intentional and controllable feelings improve over time. And there's not a lot of research out there in regards to healthiest countries for those with intellectual disabilities, but I found an older study that the Gallup News in conjunction with Special Olympics did that concluded that education plays a role in the perception of abilities. Those that were more educated and had positive feelings towards intellectual disabilities and vice versa. Overall, through survey and in-person interviews, Europe was found to be one of the best places for physical and mental health in those with intellectual disability. In conclusion, from what I have learned, it comes down to factors such as developed versus non-developed countries and rural versus urban areas that plays a major factor in health disparities and outcomes for this vulnerable population. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.